In the middle of a brutal snowstorm, a female FBI agent was found tied to a tree, left alone to freeze in the silent forest. Miles from the nearest town, a former Navy SEAL and his loyal German shepherd were the only ones who heard the quiet warning hidden in the wind. What they discovered in the snow was not just a rescue, it was the first clue to a secret buried beneath a frozen lake, a secret powerful enough to destroy a criminal network that had controlled an entire town for years. But the deeper they searched for the truth, the more dangerous the night around Black Alder Lake became. This is the story of loyalty, courage, and how sometimes a dog's instinct can reveal the truth that people try to hide. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Share your thoughts after the story, and please like and subscribe so we can reach 1,000 subscribers and bring you more stories like this. The road north ended long before the trees did. Silas Rowan drove the last miles slowly, his old pickup crunching through a narrow strip of frozen dirt that twisted between walls of dark pine. Snow had begun falling again, fine at first, almost delicate, drifting through the branches like ash from some invisible fire. Silas Rowan was 39 years old and built like a man who had spent most of his adult life carrying weight that was not his own. He stood just over 6 feet tall, about 1.83 meters, with the lean, disciplined frame of someone who had trained too long to ever grow soft. His face was clean-shaven, the skin along his jaw pulled tight over a square bone structure that looked carved rather than grown. His hair was dark brown, cut short in a military style that had grown slightly longer since he left the Navy, but not enough to hide the shape of the man beneath it. His skin had the pale tone of someone born in northern climates, yet wind and cold had burned it darker along the cheekbones. His eyes were a gray blue that seemed always to be measuring the world around him. For 8 years, he had been a Navy SEAL. For nearly 20 years before that, he had been training to become one. And now, for the first winter in nearly 2 decades, he was simply a man driving back to a cabin. Beside him sat Bruno. Bruno was a 4-year-old German shepherd with a coat that carried the classic working dog pattern, deep black across the saddle of his back and warm golden fur along his chest and legs. His muzzle was dark and strong, his ears tall and alert, even when he appeared to be resting. A faint scar cut through the edge of his left ear, a pale line that had healed years ago during a deployment overseas. Bruno's amber-brown eyes moved constantly, watching the trees, the road, and occasionally Silas himself. A worn leather collar circled the dog's neck, the metal tag softly tapping whenever the truck bounced. Bruno. The name was scratched deep enough that it would outlive both of them. Silas reached the last bend in the road just as the trees opened slightly. The lake appeared beyond them. Black Alder Lake stretched wide and silent under a gray winter sky. The surface had begun to freeze near the edges, thin sheets of pale ice reaching out like glass fingers over dark water. Wind moved across the lake in slow waves, pushing snow across the surface in ghostly patterns. And there, half hidden among tall pines, stood the cabin. The place looked smaller than Silas remembered. 40 years earlier, his grandfather had built it with his own hands. Arthur Rowan had been a forest ranger for most of his life, a tall, broad-shouldered man with thick white hair and the stubborn quiet of someone who trusted trees more than people. He had lived nearly his entire life inside these woods and believed the forest had rules older than anything written in books. Arthur used to say something Silas never forgot. The woods always tell the truth. people just stop listening. Silas parked the truck near the cabin and stepped out into the cold. The air hit his lungs like ice. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he walked toward the porch. The cabin's wood had darkened with age, but the structure still stood solid. Arthur had built it the way men used to build houses. Thick beams, heavy stone, nothing decorative that could break when winter turned cruel. Silas opened the door. Inside, the air smelled like dust, wood, and time. He moved slowly through the small rooms, brushing his gloved fingers along the table, the shelves, the stone fireplace. Everything remained almost exactly where Arthur had left it. Even the old rocking chair sat in the corner by the window. Arthur Rowan had died 12 years ago. The official report said he drowned when the ice broke beneath him while checking traps on the lake. But Silas had always wondered. Arthur knew this lake better than anyone alive. Men like that didn't fall through ice. Silas shook the thought away. He wasn't here to reopen ghosts. He came here for silence. The first afternoon passed quietly. Silas carried in supplies from the truck, checked the stove, and stacked the remaining firewood beside the wall. The pile was smaller than he hoped, too small for a full winter. The pantry inside the cabin held only a few cans, some dried beans, and a jar of salt. Arthur had probably left years ago. Silas stood near the window, watching snow gather on the branches. "We'll have to hunt," he said. Bruno lifted his head slightly, as if acknowledging the statement. The dog had hunted with him before, in places far less peaceful than this forest. Silas built a fire in the stone stove, the flames slowly pushing warmth through the cabin. Outside, the wind grew stronger, carrying snow across the lake in long, silver ribbons. By nightfall, the forest had become completely silent. No distant engines, no voices, only wind and the slow creak of wood settling under the cold. Silas sat in the old chair and stared into the fire. For the first time in years, his mind began to slow. In the Navy, silence never lasted. Even when the world was quiet, his thoughts were not. But here, the forest had a way of absorbing noise, of swallowing it whole. Bruno lay near the door, chin resting on his paws. For nearly an hour, nothing moved. Then the dog lifted his head, his ears angled forward. A low growl vibrated in his chest. Silas noticed instantly. "What is it?" Bruno did not bark. He stood and walked toward the window facing the lake. Silas joined him. At first he saw nothing. Then, far across the frozen shoreline, something flickered. A beam of light. Headlights. The light moved slowly along the tree line on the opposite side of the lake, weaving between the trunks before disappearing completely. Silas frowned. There was no road over there, no houses, no reason for vehicles to be moving through that section of forest in the middle of winter. The light vanished. The forest returned to darkness. Bruno remained at the window, body still. Silas rested his hand on the dog's neck. "Probably hunters," he muttered. But even as he said it, something inside him disagreed. Half an hour later, when Silas stepped outside to bring in another armload of wood, Bruno followed him. The dog suddenly froze near the edge of the porch. His nose lifted into the air. Then Bruno turned slowly, not toward the lake this time, but toward the dark trees behind the cabin. His ears flattened. A sound escaped his throat, not a bark, not even a growl. It was the quiet, tense sound Bruno made only when something felt wrong. Silas scanned the forest. Nothing moved. But for a brief second, just a flicker, he thought he saw a shape between the trees. tall, human, watching. The shape vanished before he could focus. The forest stood empty again. Wind moved through the branches, shaking snow loose from the limbs. Silas exhaled slowly. "Maybe I'm imagining things," he said quietly. But Bruno did not move for a long time. Morning came with pale gray light spreading across the lake. The storm had passed during the night, leaving nearly a foot of fresh snow across the forest. Silas brewed coffee over the stove and stepped outside while the steam still rose from the cup. The world looked untouched. Snow softened every edge of the land. The lake reflected the sky like dull metal, and the tall pines stood motionless under white weight. Bruno trotted ahead of him toward the shoreline. Then the dog stopped. Silas followed his gaze. There, along the narrow strip of frozen ground near the water, a set of tracks cut across the snow. Not animal tracks. Tires. Large ones. A truck had driven along the lake sometime during the night. Silas crouched beside them. The grooves were sharp, fresh. Bruno walked a few yards farther and began sniffing around a cluster of low bushes. He pawed once at the snow. Silas walked over. Half buried beneath the frost lay a torn strip of fabric, dark cloth, stiff with dried blood. Silas stared at it. The wind moved across the lake again, whispering through the trees. For a long moment, neither man nor dog spoke. Finally, Silas stood. "Well," he murmured, "that's not normal." Bruno looked up at him. The dog's amber eyes were steady, alert. Silas folded the fabric carefully and slipped it into his pocket. He turned toward the deeper forest. The woodpile behind the cabin would not last the winter. The food supply would not last even a week. They needed meat. They needed more firewood, which meant going deeper into the woods. Silas checked the rifle slung over his shoulder. "Come on," he said to Bruno. The German shepherd stepped forward immediately, tail low, body ready. Silas took one last glance toward the silent lake. Something had moved through these woods last night. Something that left blood behind. And the old instincts he thought he had buried with the Navy stirred quietly again. He and Bruno began walking into the forest. Silas had no idea that before this winter ended, the quiet lake, the old cabin, and the woods his grandfather loved would pull him back into a fight he had never planned to face again. But the forest had always had its own way of telling the truth, and this time, it had chosen Bruno to hear it first. Morning in the northern woods arrived slowly, as if the light itself had to push through layers of snow before reaching the ground. Silas Rowan moved quietly through the forest, following the faint tracks of a deer that had passed sometime during the night. Fresh snow softened every sound beneath his boots, making the entire world feel strangely muted. Above him, tall birch trees stood like pale pillars in a frozen cathedral. Their white bark reflected the gray winter light, and the thin branches rattled softly whenever the wind shifted across the lake. Beside him moved Bruno. The German shepherd walked several steps ahead, head low, nose sweeping across the snow with patient focus. At 4 years old, Bruno carried the powerful, balanced frame of a working dog bred for endurance and intelligence. His coat, golden along the chest and legs, deep black across the back, blended naturally with the winter shadows between the trees. Silas had learned long ago that Bruno rarely wasted energy. When the dog changed direction without warning, it always meant something. And now Bruno did exactly that. The dog stopped mid-stride, lifted his head, and turned sharply toward the north. Silas immediately noticed. "What is it, boy?" Bruno did not bark. Instead, he lowered his muzzle again and began moving faster, pulling slightly against the leash. His body posture shifted from relaxed movement to focused pursuit. Silas followed. He trusted the dog's instincts more than his own eyes. They moved deeper into the birch grove where the snow lay untouched, except for faint disturbances Silas had not yet noticed. The wind had quieted, leaving the forest suspended in a heavy silence. Then Bruno stopped, completely. His ears stood upright and his tail stiffened. Silas stepped beside him. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then he noticed the shape, a dark figure against the white trunk of a birch tree. A person. Silas approached slowly. As he drew closer, the details sharpened. It was a woman. She had been tied to the tree with thick nylon rope, her wrists pulled tightly behind the trunk. Silver duct tape covered her mouth. Snow clung to her shoulders and hair, forming small, icy clusters along the strands. Her head hung forward. For a moment, Silas feared he was too late. But then he saw her chest move. A shallow breath. Alive. Silas knelt beside her immediately, working quickly but carefully. Years of training had taught him to scan a scene before touching anything. The ground told its story clearly. Multiple boot prints, at least 4 individuals. The snow nearby had been churned and flattened, suggesting a struggle. A shallow drag mark led from the direction of the lake to the tree where she had been tied. And the air carried faint scents that did not belong in this quiet forest. Gasoline. Gun oil. Silas's jaw tightened slightly. "These weren't hunters," he murmured. Bruno moved closer to the woman, sniffing gently near her shoulder. The dog's behavior softened immediately, an instinctive shift from alertness to protection. Silas pulled a small tactical knife from his belt and cut through the rope. The woman's body sagged forward the moment the tension released. He caught her before she fell face first into the snow. She was lighter than he expected, her muscles rigid from the cold. Her skin felt dangerously chilled through the fabric of her jacket. Silas peeled away the tape covering her mouth. Her lips trembled as air reached them. "Easy," he said quietly. "You're okay." Her eyes fluttered open briefly. They were a deep green, sharp even through the haze of hypothermia. She tried to speak, but only a rasp escaped her throat. Silas unzipped part of her jacket to check for injuries. That was when he saw the badge clipped inside the inner pocket. FBI. The engraving read, Mara Whitlock appeared to be in her early 30s, with a lean, athletic build typical of someone accustomed to field work rather than office assignments. Even half frozen, there was something resolute in the lines of her face. High cheekbones, a narrow jaw, and dark brown hair pulled loosely into a knot at the back of her head. Her features were pale from the cold, but her eyes carried a stubborn intensity. She was not someone who gave up easily. Her fingers twitched weakly as Silas wrapped his jacket around her shoulders. "They think," she whispered. Her voice cracked. Silas leaned closer. "They think I'm dead." The wind stirred the branches overhead. "They'll come back," she finished. Then her eyes rolled back and she lost consciousness again. Silas exhaled slowly. "Well," he said quietly to Bruno, "that complicates the morning." The journey back to the cabin was slow and exhausting. Silas carried Mara across his shoulders in a fireman's hold, moving steadily through the forest, while Bruno ranged ahead and behind in short loops. The wind had begun rising again, carrying thin sheets of snow across the ground. Bruno paused frequently, turning his head toward distant sounds Silas could not yet hear. At one point, the dog stopped entirely and stared back along their trail. Silas followed his gaze. Nothing moved, but the feeling of being watched crept quietly into the back of his mind. He adjusted Mara's weight and continued walking. The cabin appeared through the trees nearly 40 minutes later. Silas kicked the door open and carried her inside. The fire in the stove had burned low during their absence, but enough coals remained to restart the flames quickly. Silas fed dry wood into the stove while Bruno lay beside Mara's still body. The dog pressed his warm flank gently against her side. Body heat. A small but meaningful gesture. Silas removed her outer jacket and wrapped her in blankets from the storage chest near the bed. Slowly, color began returning to her cheeks. Minutes passed. Then 20. Finally, Mara Whitlock inhaled sharply and opened her eyes again. This time she remained conscious. Her gaze moved around the room, studying the small cabin interior. Then it settled on Silas. "Where am I?" "Cabin by Black Alder Lake," he said. "You were tied to a tree." Her breathing slowed slightly. Mara pushed herself upright, ignoring the dizziness that followed. Her movements were controlled, disciplined, training. Her eyes shifted toward Bruno. The German shepherd watched her carefully, ears forward. "Military dog?" she asked weakly. "Former." She nodded once. Just then Bruno lifted his head sharply. His ears snapped forward. The dog walked slowly toward the cabin door. Silas noticed immediately. "What is it?" Bruno sniffed the air. Then he moved toward the window facing the lake. His body stiffened. Silas walked over beside him. Through the falling snow, something moved far across the frozen shoreline. A vehicle. The headlights flashed briefly between the trees before disappearing again. Mara saw it too. Her expression changed instantly. Not fear. Recognition. "That's them," she whispered. Silas looked at her. "You're sure?" "Yes." For a moment the room felt smaller. The fire crackled softly behind them. Outside, the snow continued falling like silent warning. Mara pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and looked back at Silas. Her voice had grown steadier now. "You need to understand something." Silas waited. "You're not just living near this forest." She paused. "You're living directly on top of a smuggling corridor." Silas leaned against the wall. "What kind of smuggling?" "Cash, equipment, data." She studied his face carefully. "People with money moving things they don't want traced." Silas glanced once more toward the dark lake. "And they tied an FBI agent to a tree for finding out." Mara nodded. "They expected the cold to finish the job." Her eyes flicked briefly toward Bruno. "But your dog ruined their plan." Bruno wagged his tail once, unaware of the significance. Silas crossed his arms. "So now what?" Mara's gaze returned to the window. "They'll realize I'm missing soon." Her tone remained calm. "And when they do," she looked back at him, "they'll come looking." Silas stared at the snowy woods beyond the cabin. The quiet he had come here for was already slipping away. He could feel it, like distant thunder beneath the surface of the lake. Bruno sat beside him, watching the trees with unwavering focus. Silas exhaled slowly. "Well," he said, "looks like winter just got interesting." The cabin felt smaller after Mara Whitlock finished speaking. Silas Rowan stood near the stove, arms crossed, listening without interruption while the fire pushed waves of warmth through the room. Outside, the storm that had begun earlier in the afternoon had grown heavier. Snow fell in thick sheets against the windows, blurring the forest until the trees looked like shadows behind frosted glass. Mara sat on the edge of the narrow bed against the wall, still wrapped in 2 wool blankets from the old chest near the fireplace. Color had begun returning to her face, but her hands remained pale from the cold she had endured in the woods. Up close, Silas could see the small details that revealed the kind of life she lived. The knuckles on her hands were slightly scarred, the faint marks of training and field work rather than office paperwork. Her dark brown hair, which had earlier been frozen stiff with snow, now hung loosely over one shoulder after she had pulled the tie free. Her eyes remained the sharpest thing about her, deep green, focused, the eyes of someone who had spent years watching people lie. Silas poured hot water into a metal mug and handed it to her. "Drink," he said. She accepted it with a quiet nod. "Thanks." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Bruno lay on the floor between them, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes open. The German shepherd's attention shifted constantly between the door, the windows, and the 2 humans inside the cabin. The dog had already decided that Mara belonged inside the circle of protection. That was enough for Silas. Finally, he leaned back against the wall. "So this Eldon Voss," he said, "you're telling me he runs a smuggling operation across the lake?" Mara blew lightly across the surface of the steaming mug before answering. "Not just smuggling." She took a slow drink. "Control." Silas raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Mara set the mug down and leaned forward slightly, the blankets falling around her shoulders. "Voss owns half the land around Black Alder Lake," she said. "Logging companies, storage properties, shipping contracts. On paper, he's just another wealthy businessman investing in the region." Her voice hardened slightly. "But he's not moving timber." She gestured vaguely toward the lake. "He's moving leverage." Silas didn't interrupt. Cash transfers, restricted technology, confidential documents, sometimes recordings. Mara paused. The kind of things powerful people pay a lot of money to keep hidden. Silas stared at the fire. "So he runs a blackmail archive." Mara nodded once. "That's the theory." "And the proof?" "That's where I came in." She leaned back against the wall. "My supervisor, Special Agent Carter Hale, started noticing irregular patterns in federal financial reports connected to northern shipping routes." Silas tilted his head slightly. "And Hale sent you alone?" Mara gave a tired half-smile. "Not exactly." She studied Silas for a moment before continuing. "Carter Hale is 45 years old, former Marine, tall guy, broad shoulders, blonde hair already starting to gray at the temples. The kind of man who looks calm even when everything is burning." She paused. "And he trusts almost no one." Silas understood that immediately. Men like that usually had a reason. He suspected someone in the local law enforcement chain might be working with Voss, Mara said. "Sheriff's office, possibly state patrol, maybe more." "So he sent you in quiet?" "Yes." Silas glanced toward the window. "And how did that work out?" Mara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she rubbed warmth back into her fingers. "I followed the money for 3 months," she said finally. "Truck shipments that didn't match cargo manifests. Storage facilities that had no recorded deliveries. boats crossing the lake at night when no traffic was scheduled. Her voice lowered slightly, and everything pointed to one location. "The old pier," Silas said. Mara looked at him sharply. "You know it? Everyone who grew up here knows it." The old pier sat on the northern edge of the lake, where the shoreline curved inward beneath a line of cliffs. Decades ago, logging barges had loaded timber there before shipping it south. Now it stood abandoned, or so people believed. Mara nodded slowly. "That's where the drop point is." Silas let out a quiet breath. "And that's where they caught you?" "Yes." She held his gaze. "I almost got inside." Outside, the wind struck the cabin walls with a long, hollow whistle. The forest groaned softly beneath the weight of snow. Bruno lifted his head again. The dog stood slowly and walked toward the back door. Silas noticed immediately. "What is it?" Bruno sniffed along the edge of the wooden frame. Then he scratched once at the floor. Silas walked over and opened the door slightly. Cold air rushed in. Nothing stood outside except the snow-covered yard and the dark shapes of pine trees swaying gently in the wind. But Bruno remained focused on the doorway. His nose worked the air carefully. Silas stepped onto the porch and looked around. Then he saw it. A small object attached beneath the wooden railing. He crouched down and pulled it free. A sensor, no larger than a matchbox. Black plastic casing. A faint blinking red light. Silas turned it in his hand. "Motion detector," he said quietly. Behind him, Mara had stood up. Her expression tightened. "They followed us." Silas nodded once. "Or they followed you." Bruno suddenly stepped forward and placed himself directly between Mara and the open door. The dog's posture changed in an instant. Not aggressive, protective. His ears pointed toward the distant forest. For several seconds, Bruno stared into the falling snow without moving. Silas watched him carefully. The dog had done this before, on deployments overseas. Sometimes Bruno reacted seconds before danger appeared, sometimes minutes, but never without reason. Then, very slowly, Bruno let out a low, rumbling growl. Not loud, not frantic, just a quiet warning. Silas felt a cold weight settle behind his ribs. Someone out there had already been close enough to place the sensor. And if they knew where Mara was now, it meant they were watching the cabin. Silas stepped back inside and closed the door. The cabin felt different now. Less like a refuge, more like a position. He turned the sensor over again in his palm. "How long ago were you captured?" he asked. Mara thought for a moment. "About 18 hours. Silas nodded. "That gives them plenty of time to realize you're missing." Mara crossed her arms. "They'll check the site where they left me first. And when they don't find a body?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Silas walked to the table and set the sensor down. Bruno followed him closely, the dog's claws clicking softly against the wooden floor. Silas stared at the map of the lake that hung on the far wall. A faded piece of paper Arthur Rowan had nailed there decades earlier. He had grown up memorizing every curve of that shoreline, every path through the trees. He had always believed those memories were part of a simpler life. Now they were something else. Terrain. Mara watched him carefully. "You don't have to get involved," she said. Silas laughed quietly. "That ship sailed the moment I cut you loose from that tree." She looked down briefly. "Fair point. Silas reached for a metal tin on the shelf and pulled out an old compass. Arthur Rowan had used it for years. The glass face was scratched but still clear. Silas turned it slowly between his fingers. My grandfather used to say, "The forest protects people who respect it." Mara looked around the cabin. This place looks like it was built by someone who expected trouble. Silas nodded once. He was a ranger. He paused. And he didn't trust businessmen cutting trees. Mara met his eyes. Did he ever mention Eldon Voss? Silas hesitated. Then he shook his head slowly. No. But something in his expression suggested the name was not entirely unfamiliar. Outside, the wind rose again. Snow rattled softly against the windows. Silas looked toward the dark forest beyond the cabin. Then he turned back to Mara. Well, he said quietly, if Voss is using the old pier, that means he's moving shipments across the water. Mara nodded. That's the hub. Silas glanced at Bruno. The dog stood alert beside him. And if we want to understand what's really happening, Silas continued, we'll have to see it ourselves. Mara studied him for a moment. You're serious? Silas shrugged. You said they'll come looking for you. She nodded. Yes. Then waiting here won't help. Silas picked up his coat. Tomorrow we go to the pier. Bruno wagged his tail once. Outside the cabin, the snow kept falling, and somewhere beyond the frozen shoreline of Black Alder Lake, the quiet operation that had hidden itself for years continued moving through the darkness. Unaware that the man and the dog in the small cabin had just decided to step into its path. Night came early in the northern woods. By late afternoon, the light had already begun to fade, turning the sky above Black Alder Lake into a dull sheet of gray steel. The snowstorm that had started earlier thickened as the sun disappeared behind the ridgeline, and the wind swept through the tall pines with a hollow sound that echoed through the forest. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low and steady. Silas Rowan moved quietly from room to room, checking every corner with the methodical patience of a man who had learned long ago that danger usually arrived when people assumed it would not. The cabin looked ordinary to anyone passing by, but Arthur Rowan had never built anything ordinary. Silas crouched beside the kitchen floor and lifted a square wooden panel near the base of the stove. Beneath it lay a narrow crawl space that from beneath the cabin and opened near the woodshed behind the house, an escape route. He lowered the panel again and crossed the room to a narrow slit between two logs near the window frame, a viewing notch. From there he could see almost the entire clearing outside. Arthur Rowan had not built a vacation home. He had built a survival shelter. Mara Whitlock stood near the table, watching Silas move through the room. Her strength had returned enough that she could stand steadily now, though her movements were still cautious after the cold she had endured earlier in the woods. The FBI agent had borrowed a thick wool sweater from the storage chest and rolled the sleeves back to free her hands. Her sharp green eyes followed Silas carefully. You weren't kidding about your grandfather, she said. Silas glanced over his shoulder. He believed winter makes people desperate. And desperate people do desperate things. Mara nodded. Seems he was right. Bruno lifted his head from beside the door. The German shepherd had been lying quietly until then, conserving energy the way working dogs instinctively do. But now his ears angled forward and his body stiffened. Silas noticed immediately. What is it? Bruno stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the storm had grown thicker, snow sweeping across the clearing in wide white curtains. At first, Silas saw nothing. Then the dog let out a low growl, not loud, just enough. Silas moved to the viewing notch. 3 dark shapes emerged from the forest. Men. They walked slowly across the clearing toward the cabin, their boots crunching through fresh snow. Each wore thick winter jackets and wool caps pulled low over their faces. One of them raised a hand and knocked on the door. 3 firm knocks. Then a voice came through the wood. "Search and rescue!" The man's voice carried the confident tone of someone used to authority. "We're checking the area for a missing person." Silas didn't move. Mara looked toward him. "That's not search and rescue." Silas nodded once. "I know." Outside, the man knocked again. "Hello? Anyone inside?" The voice sounded almost friendly. But the way the other 2 men spread out across the clearing told a different story. Silas stepped quietly away from the door. "Stay back," he murmured to Mara. Bruno had already moved into position. The German shepherd planted himself directly between the door and the interior of the cabin. His body lowered slightly, muscles tense beneath his thick coat. The knocking came again, this time louder. "Sir, we're here to help!" Silas almost smiled. He had heard that exact line before, usually 5 seconds before someone kicked down a door. The man outside tried the handle, locked. Then the voice dropped slightly. "All right," the man muttered. The friendly tone vanished. Footsteps moved across the porch. Through the viewing slit, Silas watched the 3 figures reposition. 2 moved toward the side of the cabin. The 3rd stayed near the door. "Professional," Silas whispered. Mara crossed her arms. "Voss hires experienced people." Suddenly, Bruno's posture changed. The dog lifted his nose toward the ceiling and sniffed sharply. Then he turned away from the door entirely. He faced the back wall of the cabin. Silas noticed immediately. "What is it?" Bruno growled again. But this time he wasn't warning about the men outside. He was staring at the rear corner of the cabin. Silas followed the dog's gaze and realized something that made his stomach tighten. One of the attackers had circled behind the house. The man wasn't at the door. He was standing directly beneath the rear window, listening. Silas moved fast. He crossed the room in 3 quiet steps and grabbed the long wooden lever Arthur Rowan had installed beside the wall. When he pulled it down, something shifted outside. A loud crack echoed through the clearing. One of the attackers shouted in surprise. From the viewing slit, Silas saw the reason immediately. A heavy log frame hidden along the side of the cabin had dropped suddenly, collapsing a stack of firewood and blocking the path along the wall. Arthur Rowan's trap. One of the men stumbled backward into the snow. The man at the door swore loudly. "Damn it!" Bruno barked once, deep and powerful. The dog lunged forward as the door burst open. The attacker had kicked it in with a powerful strike. He stepped inside holding a compact rifle. Bruno moved faster. The German shepherd slammed into the man's chest before he could raise the weapon. 80 pounds of muscle and momentum knocked the attacker backward through the doorway. The rifle fired once into the ceiling. Silas closed the distance instantly. He grabbed the man's arm, twisted hard, and slammed him into the wooden floor. The weapon skidded across the room. The attacker gasped in pain. Up close, Silas saw the man clearly. Mid-30s, short, dark beard, hard eyes. The kind of face that belonged to someone who had spent a long time doing violent work. Silas pinned him down. "Who sent you?" The man spat blood onto the floor. "You're already dead," he said. Outside, the other 2 attackers shouted. But they didn't rush inside. They had heard the rifle shot. They knew something had gone wrong. Silas searched the man quickly. He found a radio, a folded map, and a pistol tucked inside the man's jacket. Bruno released the man's sleeve, but remained standing over him, teeth bared in a low snarl. Silas grabbed the map and unfolded it. Mara stepped closer. Both of them stared at the markings. Several red circles had been drawn around locations across the lake. Storage buildings, boat launches, logging roads, and one mark very close to the cabin. Mara pointed to another. There. Silas followed her finger. The old pier, the same place she had mentioned earlier. That's the hub, she said quietly. Outside, the remaining attackers began retreating toward the trees. One of them spoke into a radio. Silas couldn't hear the response, but he saw their body language change. They were leaving. Before disappearing into the forest, one of them shouted toward the cabin, "You should run while you still can!" Snow whipped across the clearing as the men vanished between the pines. For a long moment, the forest returned to silence. Silas released the captured attacker and shoved him outside into the snow before locking the door again. Mara stared at the map in his hands. They'll come back. Silas nodded. He believed that too. Outside, the wind carried the last echo of the man's voice through the trees. "Tomorrow," the attacker had shouted before disappearing. "This cabin burns tomorrow." Inside the cabin, the fire crackled softly. Bruno sat beside Silas, watching the dark forest through the broken doorway. Silas folded the map slowly. The quiet life he had come here to find had ended, and the storm gathering around Black Alder Lake was only beginning. Morning arrived without color. The storm had passed sometime before dawn, leaving Black Alder Lake buried beneath a smooth, pale sheet of snow that stretched to the horizon. The sky above the forest hung low and heavy, the kind of sky that promised more winter before the day was done. Silas Rowan stepped out of the cabin first. His boots pressed into the fresh snow with a dry crunch as he paused on the porch and scanned the tree line. Years of training had left him with habits that did not disappear simply because he no longer wore a uniform. He checked the shadows, the ridges of snow, the direction of the wind. Nothing moved. Behind him, Mara Whitlock pulled the collar of her borrowed wool coat higher against the cold. Though she was still recovering from hypothermia, her posture carried the alert composure of someone who had spent years working dangerous cases. Her green eyes moved constantly across the clearing. "You still sure about this?" she asked. Silas nodded once. "They said they'd burn the cabin tonight." Mara followed his gaze across the frozen lake. "So we move first." Bruno jumped down from the porch beside them. The German shepherd shook snow from his thick yellow and black coat before stepping forward onto the open ground. At 4 years old, the dog carried the confident energy of a trained working animal, muscles balanced, ears high, every movement controlled. The scar on his left ear caught the pale morning light like a thin white thread. Silas adjusted the rifle on his shoulder. "Stay close," he told Mara. Then they began walking across the lake. The ice groaned softly beneath their weight. Black Alder Lake froze unevenly during the winter months. Near the shore, the ice thickened quickly, but toward the deeper water it formed in layers that shifted with pressure and temperature. Silas walked carefully, testing each step before placing his full weight down. Bruno moved ahead of them, nose low to the snow. Mara followed close behind. The old pier stood about half a mile from the cabin along the northern curve of the lake. From a distance it looked exactly as it had for years, an abandoned wooden structure sagging under the weight of winter. Weathered posts stuck from the frozen water like broken teeth. The roof of the storage shed had partially collapsed years ago. Everything about it suggested decay. But Mara knew better. "So where exactly is the entrance?" Silas asked quietly. Mara pointed toward the center of the pier. "Somewhere under the decking." They stepped onto the wood planks. The boards creaked under Silas's boots, though the structure held firm enough. Snow covered most of the surface, hiding the gaps between boards and the rusted metal hinges left from the old logging days. Bruno suddenly stopped. The dog lowered his nose and sniffed one particular section of snow near the edge of the pier. Then he scratched once, hard. Silas noticed immediately. "What is it, boy?" Bruno scratched again, this time more urgently. Mara crouched beside him. "There." She brushed snow aside with her gloved hands. Beneath the powder lay a rectangular steel plate nearly invisible against the weathered wood. Rust had colored the edges dark brown, blending it perfectly with the structure. Silas knelt beside it. "Hidden access hatch." He pushed against the metal. It didn't move. But when he brushed away more snow, he discovered something else. A small mechanical lever embedded into the wood. He pulled it. The plate shifted with a dull, metallic groan. Slowly, the hidden hatch lifted. Cold air rushed upward from below. A narrow steel ladder descended into darkness beneath the ice. Silas exchanged a glance with Mara. "After you," he said. The chamber below the pier was far larger than Silas expected. The ladder led down into a reinforced storage vault built directly beneath the lake. Thick steel beams supported the ceiling, and insulated walls protected the interior from the crushing cold outside. Battery-powered lights glowed along the walls. Whoever had built this place had invested serious money. Mara stepped down beside him, her eyes widening slightly as she took in the space. "This is it." Several metal storage lockers lined the far wall. Plastic crates filled with sealed envelopes and digital drives sat stacked beside a reinforced table. Silas opened the first crate. Inside were rows of external hard drives carefully labeled with dates. Mara opened another container. Bundles of cash, stacks of passports, encrypted flash drives. Her jaw tightened. "This isn't just smuggling." Silas looked at her. "What is it?" "Blackmail." She held up a folder. Inside were printed photographs. Grainy images of politicians, business executives, and law enforcement officials in situations they would never want made public. Silas flipped open another file. Video discs. Each one labeled with a name. And beneath the names, dates. Mara's voice dropped. "Insurance policies." Silas continued searching. One locker contained surveillance footage stored on small memory cards. Another held bank routing information linked to offshore accounts. This vault was not just storage. It was the heart of Eldon Voss's operation. Then Silas opened the final locker and froze. Inside lay a rusted metal badge, Forest Ranger. The name engraved beneath the scratched surface read, Caleb Turner. Silas stared at it. "That name mean something?" Mara asked. Silas nodded slowly. "Caleb Turner worked with my grandfather." His voice carried a weight he hadn't expected. "He disappeared 15 years ago." Mara studied the badge. "And you think Voss had something to do with it?" Silas didn't answer, but his silence said enough. Suddenly Bruno stiffened. The German shepherd's ears snapped upright. He turned toward the ladder above them and began growling. Silas looked up. At first he heard nothing. Then, footsteps. Slow. Careful. Someone was walking across the pier overhead. Bruno moved closer to the ladder, his body tense. Silas grabbed Mara's arm and pulled her behind the steel support column. The footsteps stopped. A shadow moved across the opening at the top of the ladder. Then a man's voice muttered quietly, "Something's open." The guard climbed down cautiously. He carried a shotgun across his chest, the barrel pointed downward, but ready. The man appeared to be in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, thick beard dusted with snow, and a scar running along the side of his jaw that pulled one corner of his mouth into a permanent half-snarl. This was not a hired amateur. This was someone who had spent years working security for dangerous people. His name, though Silas did not know it yet, was Logan Pike. Pike stepped into the chamber slowly. His eyes swept the room. Then they landed on the open lockers. "Damn it!" Bruno lunged first. The German Shepherd exploded from behind the column with a burst of speed that caught Pike completely off guard. The dog slammed into the man's arm just as the shotgun began to rise. The weapon fired once into the ceiling. Ice dust rained down from the metal beams. Silas tackled Pike before the man could recover. They crashed against the steel wall. Pike fought hard. But Silas had spent years fighting men stronger than this. Within seconds, he had the shotgun twisted from Pike's grip. "Run!" Silas shouted to Mara. She grabbed the portable drive unit from the table and sprinted toward the ladder. Silas shoved Pike aside and followed. Bruno bounded up the ladder ahead of them. Outside the vault, the frozen lake stretched silent beneath the gray sky. But the gunshot had carried far. Silas looked toward the distant shoreline. Movement. 2 more men emerging from the tree line. Mara turned back to him. "More guards." Silas grabbed her arm. "Move!" They ran across the ice. Behind them, Logan Pike climbed out of the hatch, shouting into his radio. The surface of the lake cracked faintly beneath Silas's boots. The sound echoed like distant thunder. He realized something then. They had crossed a line that could never be undone. This was no longer about rescuing Mara. They had uncovered the buried skeleton of everything that had happened around Black Alder Lake for years. And now every man working for Eldon Voss would be hunting them. Silas glanced down at Bruno running beside him. The dog's breath came in steady clouds of white. Silas tightened his grip on the rifle. The truth buried beneath the ice had finally been exposed, and there was no turning back. The lake turned silver at dusk. Silas Rowan and Mara Whitlock reached the tree line just as the fading light stretched across Black Alder Lake like a sheet of dull metal. Behind them, the frozen surface they had crossed hours earlier now looked deceptively peaceful, hiding the chaos they had triggered beneath the pier. The portable drive containing the copied data rested inside Mara's backpack. Every step she took now carried the weight of evidence that could dismantle Eldon Voss's entire criminal network. But it also made them targets. Bruno trotted ahead of them through the trees, his thick yellow-black coat brushing against the low branches. The German Shepherd moved with the controlled rhythm of a trained K9, ears forward, head high, nose constantly testing the air. Silas noticed the dog's posture had changed. Not panic. Alertness. "We're close," Silas murmured. Ahead of them, the clearing around the cabin opened between the trees, and then they saw the fire. The woodshed beside the cabin was already burning. Flames climbed the old timber walls in long, twisting tongues, sending sparks high into the night sky. Orange light reflected across the snow, turning the quiet forest into something that looked almost unreal. like a battlefield painted in winter colors. Silas stopped walking. They're here. Mara's breath formed white clouds in the cold air as she studied the clearing. At least 5 figures moved near the cabin. Some stood near the burning shed. Others circled the building slowly. They're trying to flush us out, she said quietly. Silas nodded. Classic pressure tactic. Burn something close. Force the target to reveal himself. Bruno let out a low rumble in his throat. Silas crouched beside the dog and rested a hand on the animal's neck. Easy. For a moment, Silas simply watched the cabin. The firelight illuminated the porch, the windows, the old wooden beams Arthur Rowan had carved decades earlier. That cabin had been the last place on Earth that belonged to his family, and now it was about to disappear. Silas inhaled slowly. Then he turned to Mara. We're not going through the front. Mara raised an eyebrow. You've got another way out. Silas nodded. My grandfather built it. The tunnel beneath the cabin was narrow and low. Silas lifted the hidden floor panel inside the kitchen and led Mara downward into the crawl space while Bruno slipped through beside them. Above them, the crackle of fire grew louder. The tunnel ran beneath the cabin foundation and emerged behind the woodshed, exactly where Arthur Rowan had designed it decades earlier. Silas pushed the outer hatch open. Cold air rushed inside. They crawled out into the forest behind the cabin. From that angle, they could see the entire clearing. The attackers had spread out carefully. One man kicked open the cabin door. Another poured gasoline along the porch railing. The fire spread quickly. Silas watched the flames reach the roofline. For a moment, something deep in his chest tightened. He remembered standing on that porch as a boy, while Arthur Rowan taught him how to split firewood. He remembered summer mornings fishing along the shoreline. All of it was burning now. Mara noticed the expression on his face. I'm sorry, she said quietly. Silas shook his head. It's just a building. But the way his voice carried told another story. They moved deeper into the forest while the fire consumed the cabin behind them. Snow muffled their footsteps as they climbed on a narrow ridge overlooking the far end of the lake. When they stopped, Mara pulled the drive from her backpack. We still have the data, she said. Silas looked toward the distant shoreline. Doesn't matter if we can't send it. Mara nodded. That's why we go to the sawmill. The abandoned sawmill sat at the southern end of Black Alder Lake, nearly 2 miles away. It had closed decades earlier when the logging industry shifted farther west. But Mara had discovered something during her investigation. Inside the mill's old control office was an emergency radio transmitter, once used to communicate with supply barges. A relic, but still functional. If we power it up, Mara said, I can send the files directly to Carter Hale. Silas looked at Bruno. The dog stood alert beside him, watching the glowing sky where the cabin burned. Then we move. They reached the sawmill just before midnight. The building loomed dark against the snowy landscape, a massive wooden structure sagging under decades of winter storms. Broken windows lined the upper walls, and the rusted skeleton of an old conveyor system stretched out toward the frozen shoreline. The place smelled faintly of old oil and frozen timber. Bruno stepped cautiously inside first. His nails clicked against the concrete floor. Silas followed, scanning the shadows between the machinery. The transmitter room sat near the back of the building. Mara pushed open the door. Dust coated everything inside. A large metal console filled one wall, its switches frozen in place by years of disuse. Give me a minute, she said. She knelt beside the generator panel and began reconnecting the wires with steady hands. Silas stood guard near the doorway. The wind howled through the broken windows above. For several minutes, the only sound was Mara working with the cables. Then a slow clap echoed through the empty mill. Silas turned instantly. A man stepped from the shadows near the loading dock. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a long charcoal overcoat that looked far too expensive for the harsh northern winter. His silver-streaked hair was combed neatly back, and his clean-shaven face carried the calm confidence of someone who believed the world belonged to him. Eldon Voss. The man's pale gray eyes moved calmly between Silas and Mara. "Impressive," he said. His voice was smooth, almost polite. "I was curious who had the nerve to interfere with my operations." Behind him, several armed men stepped into the light. Logan Pike stood among them, his jaw bruised from the earlier fight. Voss folded his gloved hands behind his back. "You must be Silas Rowan." Silas said nothing. Voss smiled faintly. "Your grandfather was difficult." The comment landed like a stone. "He asked too many questions about my logging permits." Silas's eyes narrowed. Voss continued casually. "Unfortunately, curiosity can be dangerous." Mara glanced briefly at Silas. The implication was clear. Voss tilted his head slightly. "But I'm a reasonable man." He gestured toward the door. "Walk away from the lake. Take your dog. Take the woman." Then he added quietly, "And I'll make sure you're compensated." Silas almost laughed. "You're offering to buy me." "Not buy," Voss corrected. "Reward." Silas shook his head slowly. "No deal." Just then Bruno stepped forward. The dog moved directly in front of Silas, body rigid. But instead of growling at the armed men, Bruno stared at Eldon Voss himself. The German shepherd's ears flattened slightly. His nose twitched. Then the dog let out a low, unfamiliar whine. Silas frowned. Bruno almost never made that sound. Not in combat, not under threat. It was the sound the dog made when he recognized a scent from long ago. Silas suddenly remembered something. During one of Arthur Rowan's final visits years earlier, Bruno had reacted exactly the same way when an unfamiliar truck had driven past the cabin. Silas's eyes shifted slowly back to Voss. The realization settled in his mind like ice. Bruno recognized him. Mara slammed the final switch. The generator roared to life. Lights flickered on across the room. The transmitter console hummed as electricity surged through the ancient circuits. Voss's expression darkened. "Unfortunate," he murmured. One of his men raised a rifle. Silas moved first. He shoved Mara toward the radio console. "Send it!" Gunfire erupted inside the sawmill. Bullets tore through old wooden beams as Silas returned fire from behind a steel machine housing. Bruno lunged across the floor with explosive speed. One of the gunmen aimed at Mara. The German shepherd slammed into the man's legs, knocking him sideways just as he fired. The shot shattered a window instead. Mara finished uploading the data. Her fingers moved rapidly across the transmitter keys. The final signal burst across the radio waves. Miles away, somewhere beyond the forest and the frozen lakes, Special Agent Carter Hale would soon receive the message. Inside the mill, the firefight continued. But the truth was already traveling through the air. Silas ducked behind cover as another bullet struck the metal beside him. Across the room, Mara looked up from the transmitter. "It's sent!" Silas nodded once. Outside, the distant wail of approaching sirens began to echo faintly across the frozen lake. The night at Black Alder was finally beginning to end. The gunfire inside the sawmill faded into silence. For several long seconds after Mara Whitlock transmitted the final signal, no one moved. The hum of the old radio console still vibrated faintly through the metal walls, and the scent of burned wiring drifted through the cold air. Silas Rowan crouched behind the rusted machine housing, his rifle steady against his shoulder. Across the floor, Bruno stood with his body low and rigid, the German shepherd's eyes fixed on the men who had moments ago been firing toward the transmitter. Eldon Voss had already stepped back. The tall businessman stood near the loading dock doors, the calm composure on his face slightly cracked now. His expensive charcoal coat hung open, revealing the tailored suit beneath it. Clothing far too refined for a place that smelled of sawdust and rust. But Voss was not a man who panicked easily. His pale gray eyes shifted from Silas to Mara. "You think that signal changes anything?" he asked quietly. Mara remained beside the radio console, breathing hard from the adrenaline of the fight. Her dark hair had come loose from its tie and fell across one side of her face, but her posture remained steady. "It changes everything," she said. Voss studied her for a moment. Then he smiled. "You're assuming the right people will listen." Silas kept the rifle aimed at the man. "They will." Voss shrugged lightly. "We'll see." Outside, the wind swept across the frozen lake again, rattling loose metal sheets along the roof of the abandoned mill. Snow drifted through the broken windows in thin spirals. The armed men beside Voss shifted uneasily. They had heard the transmission. They knew what it meant. But none of them moved first. For several minutes, the standoff held. Then the distant sound arrived. At first it was faint, a low rhythmic vibration beneath the wind. Silas tilted his head slightly. Helicopter blades. Mara heard it too. Her shoulders lowered a fraction as relief crossed her face. Voss did not turn toward the sound, but his expression hardened. "Well," he murmured, "it seems you were right." Without warning, he moved. Voss spun toward the back exit and bolted through the open door, disappearing into the storm outside. "Stop!" Mara shouted. Silas was already moving. "Stay here," he told her. Bruno sprinted after him. The snow outside had thickened again. Wind tore across the lake in long white waves that erased footprints almost as quickly as they appeared. Silas spotted Voss immediately. The businessman had reached a snowmobile parked beside the mill's collapsed loading ramp. He kicked the engine alive with quick, practiced movements. Voss had prepared an escape route. The machine roared to life just as Silas and Bruno burst from the doorway. The snowmobile shot forward across the frozen lake. Silas swore under his breath. He raised the rifle but lowered it again immediately. Too far. Too much wind. And the ice beneath the snow was uneven. "Come on!" Silas said. He and Bruno ran toward the lake. The helicopter sound grew louder now, echoing through the sky like distant thunder. Silas looked up. A dark shape appeared through the clouds. Federal. The helicopter descended toward the frozen shoreline, sending whirlwinds of snow spinning across the surface of the lake. The aircraft touched down roughly 50 yards ahead of Voss's path. The side door slid open. Several figures jumped out immediately. One of them moved with the confidence of someone used to command. Special Agent Carter Hale. Hale was taller than most men around him, just over 6 feet, with the broad shoulders of a former Marine and the controlled presence of someone who had spent his life in command roles. His blonde hair had begun turning silver at the temples, but his movements carried none of the hesitation of age. His pale blue eyes locked onto the approaching snowmobile instantly. "Federal agents!" he shouted through a megaphone. "Cut the engine!" Voss did the opposite. The machine accelerated. Silas reached the shoreline just as Voss attempted to veer around the helicopter, but the ice betrayed him. The front ski struck a ridge of uneven ice hidden beneath the snow. The snowmobile tipped sideways. Voss was thrown hard across the frozen surface, sliding several yards before coming to a stop. Bruno reached him first. The German shepherd planted himself directly over the fallen man, teeth bared in a deep, warning growl. Voss raised his hands slowly. Carter Hale and his agents arrived seconds later. 2 agents cuffed Voss while Hale studied the scene calmly. Silas approached slowly. Hale looked him over once. "You Rowan?" Silas nodded. Hale extended a gloved hand. "Special Agent Carter Hale." Silas shook it briefly. "Your signal reached us just in time." Behind them, more helicopters circled above the forest as additional federal agents moved toward the sawmill. The quiet conspiracy hidden around Black Alder Lake was collapsing in real time. While the agents secured Voss, Bruno wandered a few steps away across the frozen lake. The dog's nose lowered to the snow. He sniffed carefully along a narrow ridge in the ice. Then he stopped. Bruno pawed gently at the surface. Silas walked over. "What is it?" The German shepherd scratched once more, uncovering a thin layer of snow. Beneath it lay a rusted metal plate frozen into the ice. Silas brushed the snow aside. Carved faintly into the surface were 3 letters. A.R. Arthur Rowan. Silas stared at the mark. He had seen that carving before, years ago on one of his grandfather's trap markers along the lake. But this one had been deliberately scratched into the metal. A signal. A warning. Or perhaps a message left long before any of this began. For a moment, Silas felt as though the old ranger's presence still lingered somewhere in the silent woods. Bruno looked up at him. The dog's amber eyes reflected the pale morning light. The investigation that followed unfolded quickly. Within hours, the federal task force had seized the vault beneath the pier and secured the evidence Mara Whitlock had discovered. Agents combed through the files and video recordings stored in Eldon Voss's hidden archive. The results shook the entire region. Dozens of corrupt officials had been secretly controlled through blackmail. Several missing persons cases dating back more than 15 years were reopened. Among the arrests was the local sheriff, Dale Mercer. Mercer was a heavy-set man in his early 50s with thinning brown hair and a face that carried the tired look of someone who had spent years pretending to serve the law while quietly betraying it. When agents escorted him out of the sheriff's office in handcuffs, he avoided looking at the townspeople gathered outside. The truth spread through the county faster than the winter wind. Weeks passed. The snowstorm slowly faded as February gave way to early spring. One afternoon, Mara returned to the lakeshore where the cabin had once stood. Only a blackened foundation remained where Arthur Rowan's home had burned. Silas worked nearby, stacking fresh logs into the frame of a new structure, rising slowly from the ground. It was smaller than the old cabin, simpler, but built strong. Mara approached quietly. "You're really staying," she said. Silas nodded. Someone should. Bruno raced along the frozen shoreline, chasing a flock of startled ravens that lifted into the sky with loud wing beats. Mara watched the dog for a moment. Carter said the evidence from the vault may solve several missing persons cases. Silas looked out across the lake. Good. She hesitated before speaking again. We're restoring the records of the forest rangers who disappeared. Silas's gaze drifted toward the distant trees. Caleb Turner? Yes. And the others? Silas nodded slowly. The wind moved gently across the lake, carrying the faint scent of thawing earth. Mara stepped back toward the road. Take care of yourself, Rowan. Silas smiled faintly. You too. She walked away. Bruno returned a moment later and sat beside Silas, tail thumping lightly against the snow. Silas rested a hand on the dog's head. The new cabin frame stood behind them, rising slowly from the ground like a promise. Locals had already begun calling the place something different. Not the Rowan cabin, but Rowan House. A place where veterans, travelers, and anyone lost in the northern winters could find shelter. Silas looked across the quiet lake. Maybe Grandpa was right, he murmured. Bruno tilted his head. Silas smiled slightly. The forest always tells the truth. And this time he had finally learned to listen. In the quiet forests around Black Alder Lake, the truth did not arrive with thunder. It arrived slowly, through courage, loyalty, and a dog who refused to ignore what his instincts told him. Silas Rowan did not go to the lake looking for a fight. He went there looking for silence, for a place where the noise of war inside his mind could finally rest. But life often works in ways we do not expect. Sometimes when we believe we are walking away from battle, we are actually walking toward the moment we were meant to face all along. Bruno, a simple dog with a loyal heart, was the first to hear what others could not. Animals do not overthink the way humans do. They respond to truth, to danger, to the quiet signals of the world around them. In many ways, that instinct can feel like a small miracle, because sometimes the smallest voice is the one God uses to guide us. In this story, a man who wanted peace found himself protecting justice. A dog who only followed loyalty ended up uncovering a hidden truth. And a place that once held corruption became a place of refuge and healing. That is how grace often works in our lives. God does not always send signs in dramatic ways. Sometimes the guidance we need comes through a moment of intuition, through a loyal companion, or through the quiet feeling in our heart that tells us something is not right. And when we listen to that voice, when we choose courage instead of fear, something beautiful can happen. Darkness loses its power when even one person decides to stand for truth. The story of Silas and Bruno reminds us that we are never truly alone in our struggles. Even when the road feels cold and uncertain, God is often working quietly behind the scenes, guiding the right people into our path and placing strength in places we did not know existed. In our daily lives, we may not face criminals or hidden conspiracies, but we all face moments where we must choose between doing what is easy and doing what is right. Those choices shape not only our lives, but the lives of others around us. Maybe the lesson of this story is simple. Listen carefully. Protect what is good. Stand for truth even when the cost feels heavy. And never underestimate the quiet miracles that appear when faith, courage, and loyalty walk together. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need encouragement today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from and what part of the story spoke to you the most. And if you believe that stories of hope, loyalty, and justice still matter in this world, consider subscribing to the channel so more people can hear them. May God watch over you and your family. May He give you strength in difficult days, peace in your home, and wisdom to recognize the quiet guidance He places in your path. And may we all learn, just like Silas did, that sometimes the truth is already speaking to us. We only need the courage to listen.